All right, great. Well, welcome to another Bother the Father. Again, this is kind of an open forum. It's kind of just a way of answering any lingering questions or maybe questions you want to ask. It's relatively anonymous, so for the most part, sorry, Daniel, you're not necessarily anonymous, but that's okay. But yeah, we kind of open it up. Any questions or anything pressing?
No. First one that I have is recently, and I might say actually the last couple of years, I've felt a calling to support intellectually disabled. And I was wondering about any sort of church or big biblical guidance actually around supporting this group of people, as I, discern and think about how I could, bring Jesus to this group.
Yeah, no, I think that's a wonderful thing. I mean, I think the development of understanding of mental health has really kind of made quite a few advances in the last like few decades. I think it's interesting that you look at things like in the gospel with like the different like demoniacs and these different kind of demons, for lack of a better word, kind of possessing these people. That's not to say we wouldn't believe there weren't demons involved with this. But you could also say that maybe many of them were struggling with mental illness, right? It's interesting because the church takes a very conservative approach when it comes to like someone who may be possessed, because they really go to great extents to make sure it's not something else going on, including mental illness. So I think taking that as part of ministry is something that should be upheld, and it's something that the church teaches would be good. And I think that comes down to one of the first tenets of the Catholic social justice teaching when it comes to protecting the poor and vulnerable.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, so people that experience these issues, for lack of a better word, experiences, yeah, they deserve respect and dignity. They're made in the image and likeness of God, and we should do anything we can to help them. I think the struggle there though is because it's a hard science to kind of understand. The question sometimes the overwhelming thing, but where do I begin? I don't have a license in psychotherapy or psychiatry or anything else like that.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm thinking more kind of like mentally handicapped, like Down syndrome.
Yeah,
things
sure,
like that.
right.
That's kind of where
Good.
I feel that. So
Good.
yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think we always look for different ways and different ministries we can actually participate. And I mean, simply just like kind of going to the hospital and being there is, I think, something that's very encouraging. Or, I mean, there are definitely different ways you can approach that. I mean, even like adopting children with Down syndrome can be something that's very powerful now. That has to be something discerned, right? And something that should be, prayed about and looked at, especially for maybe families that already have several children. But no, I think that's something that's kind of maybe sometimes overlooked in ministry. But yeah, I think if you go to any of the Catholic hospitals, I'd be more than happy to have any help as far as that's concerned, as an opportunity for volunteering. I mean, I know that I don't know if they necessarily have a pediatric ward for those with mental illness, but I do know they have a mental illness facility at like Mercy South.
Okay.
As St. Anthony. Now that stuff they keep that very confidential, and they keep that very, for good reason. Want people's reputation to be, scorned. I mean, there's still, even though there's been advancement in developmental health and mental health treatment, it still can be looked on as a stigma. So I think they try to keep that HEPA laws and all that stuff kind of in place. But I think they would be open to having people to help, signing waivers, all that good stuff if you wanted to. So yeah, I think that's something that's good. Yeah. All right. Yeah. Good. Wonderful. Good. Yeah, Mickey's here. Any other thoughts, any questions or further discussion?
how about the Pope doesn't like the Latin Mass? Why is he trying to get away from Latin? He's killing our history.
So
And I
I'm sorry, go ahead, Mickey. Yeah.
I just don't get it. I don't understand why something that's that beautiful. I mean, I remember all those songs and everything by heart. I still could sing them, which is unbelievable. But
Yeah.
and I think it sounds beautiful, and I think it's just makes people think back when they were a child. And he's taken that all away for some reason, and I don't get it.
Yeah, that's a puzzler, Mickey. I mean, I know talking to my brother priests, and especially those of us who have a great affinity for the extraordinary form, this is kind of it's kind of a head scratcher. I mean, if you take what he actually wrote in his document a couple years ago, I mean, I can see the rationale he's making. He's kind of saying that never before we had two forms of the Mass in the history of the church, which is true. Well, let's put it this way. It's not completely true. We've never had two official forms of the Mass. If you look at the history of the liturgy, at one point there were several different rites that were going on within the Latin rite. And part of that's just because there was not a clear understanding of like, well, what do we do? Right. So I mean, even the very earliest part of the church, there's always been the same structure. So you always have liturgy of the word, liturgy of the Eucharist, but like what you do when was kind of an open question. Like you would see from the writings of Cyril of Jerusalem and some of the other early church fathers, there's kind of like an interesting positioning of like, let's say the sign of peace. So in some masses, the sign of peace comes like at the very beginning. You kind of start with the sign of peace. Like I'm bringing this to the altar, and I'm preparing myself to bring this to the altar by giving peace to my brother, right? That kind of thing. There are other rites that we see like we do in the Novus Ordo today in the extraordinary form, where it's more right before communion. Well, even the extraordinary form, there's not really much of a sign of peace. It's really more the priests and the ministers. But even the Novus Ordo, you kind of see that same structure where the sign of peace is. So these have been open questions for the first few centuries of the church. And it really wasn't until the church started to expand, primarily by St. Benedict and other kind of fathers of different orders, where it's kind of thought, okay, we're going to evangelize these people out in these different areas. And it's like, okay, we got a lot of different masses going on. What mass do we use? And it was, I think, rightly decided, well, let's use whatever the mass the Pope is using. Because if he's the father, the head of the church, it makes sense we do what he does. And so you see this development of like, there becomes these unified forms of the Latin Rite in the Gregorian, in the Ambrosian Mass. I mean, so these different ways are going by what the Pope was doing, and that because of the evangelization methods of the church, those are being implemented in these new Christian people. And so it was always uniform from then on. So to make the statement that we've never had two official forms of the church is true. And so in order to remove confusion, I guess it kind of makes sense to go to one or the other. Now, I think his rationale that there are certain abuses in the TLM, and again, maybe there are. I mean, I think a lot of that's kind of based on maybe internet trolls and certain like comments made in, on YouTube or whatever. I don't know, at least here in St. Louis, of many people who go to the Extraordinary Form Mass would say the TLM is the only way to do it. The ordinary form of the Mass is non-valid. It's a bad, it's not Jesus. I don't know anyone who goes to the TLM who would profess that. So, well, where does that leave us? Well, I think firstly, we have to recognize is that Holy Father himself cannot get rid of Latin. That he cannot do that. And the reason he can't do that is because, well, we're the Latin Rite Church. So the prayers we use, the readings we use, everything we use is actually based on Latin anyway. And even to come up with a new rite in the Latin Church, it would have to be based in Latin regardless. Now you can say, well, why don't we emphasize Latin more in even the Novus Ordo? Well, that's a good question. And I think part of that we talked about in other sessions before, where you kind of see this catch-22 that started kind of after Vatican II, where there was this mindset out of Vatican II that, oh, we're not doing Latin, we're doing the vernacular. Where what actually Vatican II said was, well, the vernacular can be used for catechetical reasons, but the intention is always to use Latin. But that intention to use Latin part kind of got glossed over and lost, and people just went forward with, okay, great, let's just start making these books in English. Let's start doing these books in French and whatever. Let's do that. And they stopped teaching Latin. And then we get, 40 years later and we say, well, why aren't we teaching Latin anymore? Well, because we're not using liturgy. Well, why are we using liturgy? Because it says we can. Well, because we're not teaching Latin. So as far as the Holy Father's reasons, I mean, I think that it may be a fair reason to say there's abuses in the TLM, but I think what has confounded a lot of people and also confused people is, well, you kind of addressed that in the extraordinary form, but you didn't really address it in the Novus Ordo. To that point, one thing that's kind of helpful, but also kind of scary now, is that everybody streams masses. And even now you can go back in certain streamings on certain masses here in the Archdiocese of St. Louis, and you see abuses. And what I mean by that is you have priests that maybe change the words of the institution narrative. They still say, this is my body, this is my blood, but they're not following the rubric in the Eucharistic prayer. There was one priest I saw, who will remain nameless, here in our Archdiocese, that at a Christmas Mass, I believe it was a Christmas vigil, after his homily, decided to have a dance party. Now, even though there's nothing explicit in the rubric that says, hey, you shouldn't do that, that shows, I think, great imprudence. And I don't think that's worthy of the dignity of the holy sacrifice of the Mass. That's my personal opinion. I mean, even if it was maybe done for a good reason, I would say that seems like an abuse that should not be included in the liturgy. So I think that's kind of part of the struggle, is why wasn't that ever really addressed in his, his papal bull? And as far as his kind of diminishment of the extraordinary form, I don't get it either. I don't know if he had some experience with the extraordinary form, which left him a bad taste in his mouth. It's hard to argue that it's not personal. And I don't know what that is for him. I think the saving grace would be, though, is that he left it in the hands of the individual bishops to make those terminations, which was good. I think Archbishop Rosansky has taken a very even keel approach to it. I think he understands the importance of the extraordinary form and that the spiritual good it does for a lot of people. And so he's taken that understanding, and that's why he's not suppressing it fully in the Archdiocese. Also, the Holy Father is not going to be the Holy Father forever. What I mean by that is he's not going to be living on this earth forever. And so everything he has done can be undone. Because what he put in that document was not infallible. It was not in the line with a matter of faith and reason based on the teaching of the church. Even though he was doing it at the Pope and he has that authority, it's not what we call doctrine or dogma of the church, that there can't be two forms of the Mass. So I think we definitely want to be understand what was going on here. But also I think we can have some hope. Because I think there's a lot of priests in this generation that are kind of the post-conciliar, or ordained more like, in the last couple decades, maybe even considered millennial priests, who do have that affinity for the extraordinary form. And you would imagine these priests are going to become bishops someday. And I think that's also going to be kind of a way for the church to kind of look at this in a different light and say, well, what is really the issue going on here, and why wouldn't the extraordinary form be promoted? To tell you the truth, I mean, personally, I think the biggest advertiser for the good of the extraordinary form is young people are going there. If you go to extraordinary form mass, whether it be at St. Barnabas or at the Oratory or down at Francis Sales, it's always very young people, young families, and they have like 90 kids. Good. So I don't know. I think there's whatever happened with the Holy Father. I guess he had a bad experience or something. I really don't know. I don't have a good answer for that. I understand his rationale. We could argue whether that's actually good rationale. And I think the main argument comes down to why would you talk about the abuses in the extraordinary form, but remain silent when it comes to the Novus Ordo? I think it's fair. And we can critique that. We can do that. That's okay. Right? That's not a sin to say, well, Father, what are you thinking about there? And question it. That's not a problem.
Well, doesn't he have sometimes masses in different countries in different languages anyway?
I imagine he does. But
I
I
mean,
would be surprised if he has any in Latin.
And ETWN, he's had people from all the different countries using their own language, and you're wondering what's with this guy? You know?
Because I think maybe the main difference is that it's still their own language. To have a mass in French or German or Spanish or Swahili or Mandarin. Well, okay, yeah, that still shows the universality of the church, and that I think was the intent of the Church Fathers of Vatican II, which is why they allowed the use of vernacular. But primarily, they were allowing that use because the Mass was new. It was slightly different than the TLM, and so it took some time for people to understand what was actually happening and what was different. There was a great story. I just heard this. That after Paul VI promulgated the documents of Vatican II, he came for Mass to get ready for Mass on the Sunday after Pentecost. And he started investing in red vestments, because in the old form of the Mass, you have these like multiple Sundays after Pentecost. And you don't go straight to ordinary time. And so with the new calendar, though, his MC said, "Oh, your Holiness, what are you doing? You can't vest in red. It's no longer Easter. It's no longer Pentecost. We're right into ordinary form." And it was said that he was very disappointed about that. And it's like, well, you promulgated this as the Pope, right? You signed up on this. This is what you said. And so even the Holy Father, there was some confusion about how that changed. And so it made sense to make things in the vernacular so people could understand it. But the question is, well, okay, to what point do we get where people understand what's going on and we should start using Latin again? That's still an open question. Right? I mean, my thought is, why not now? Now the rational response to that would be, well, we don't know Latin. Okay. That's why I have a Latin class every Sunday night at 7:00. That's why we celebrate certain Novus Ordo Latin masses throughout the year. Rate Caeli in December. We just had one on Monday for yesterday for the Feast of St. Joseph. And I'm going to plan to keep on doing that at least once a month so that people can maybe get used to it a little bit. As a matter of fact, the liturgy committee met last night and they said we should start promulgating that parish wide. So I'm going to talk to Monsignor about what he wants to do with that. But yeah, I think we need to start moving back towards that. Because there was something about, I think too, that no matter where in the world you go, you can trust it's the same Mass said in the same language. And before 1970, that was the case. you went anywhere in the world to a Latin Rite Mass, you knew what the Mass was the same, whether it be in your hometown, in Japan, in Italy, in Uganda, wherever you were, it was the same Mass. So, yeah, I mean, Latin in the Mass is still allowed to be used, and that's always going to be allowed to be used because that's the history of the church. As far as the two forms, yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think we should start moving more towards the Latin in the Novus Ordo. That's my personal opinion. I think there are certain ways you can do that and do that well. I mean, it'll be hard because of the change that comes with that, and people don't like change. But I think it may be worth it. Good. Any other thoughts, questions, concerns, heresies?
So just coming off Feast of Saint Joseph, he's very seldom mentioned in the Bible, maybe 2, 3 times.
Three, maybe, yeah, right. Never says a word.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, any biblical scholars speculate why for such a important figure that there isn't more written?
I think that kind of shows the humility of Saint Joseph. I mean, also too, like, yeah, I said this in the homily yesterday at the Mass, is that, what we know of Jesus, what was said about Mary is actually pointing to who Jesus is. And what we say about Joseph actually points to who Mary is. And so, being the least holy of the Holy Family, he may have felt somewhat, but part of that too could be just the fact that nobody really knew anything about the early life of Jesus in Nazareth. And so if you look at all the gospel writers, they kind of start with the birth, but then they jump all the way up to when he's 30, right? And we can ask, well, why is that? Well, part of that comes down to why the books of the New Testament were chosen to be the canon, because there were other gospels written by other people after the resurrection, but the criteria that was used at the Council of Nicaea to determine what was actually valid and what wasn't was first off, does it fall in line with apostolic teaching? And secondly, can the author be attributed to the person that wrote it, or the person it was attributed to?
Yeah.
So in other words, okay, like the Gospel of Mary Magdalene. Well, there might be some good stuff in there, right? That can be true, but there's certain things in there. It's like, well, this doesn't seem to be in line with who Jesus was. And the fact that the manuscript came out, that it was actually written like hundreds of years after the death of Jesus, in which case Mary Magdalene herself would have been dead by then. So that could have been written by her, in which case we can't use this. I think the most interesting story about Joseph actually comes from the Protoevangelium of James. And so there's a gospel attributed to James. I'm not sure if it's James the Greater or James the Lesser, but there's a story about how Joseph became betrothed to Mary. And it's almost kind of Homerific. And so in fact that it's kind of Odyssean in the way they approach it. So if anyone's ever read the Odyssey, I don't know, maybe not. Odysseus is this general who went to go fight in the Trojan War, and he's making his way back home, and the gods get angry with him, and he goes through all these different kind of ventures and turmoils. Well, he finally reaches home, and he finds that his wife is being pursued by all these suitors. And so he disguises himself and then actually competes against these suitors to win the hand of his wife. These competitions only he could do. So in the story of the betrothal of Mary and Joseph, Joachim and Anne, realizing Mary's purity and her innocence and her virtue, they want to find the best person they can to be her groom. And so they kind of set up this little competition. And they say, we have this staff here, and whoever grabs the staff and start to blossom, that's a sign from God that they are supposed to be betrothed to my daughter. Well, of course, all the people in Galilee try, and the one that comes up and succeeds is Joseph. And so that was a sign of his purity and his humility. And so that he was chosen by Joachim and Anne to be the Mary's betrothed. Which is why we see today the statues of Joseph with the flowering staff. Now, there are Old Testament references to that, specifically with Aaron, Aaron, the brother of Moses, who was the first high priest, that we have said that when he grabbed the staff, it would flower too. And so, okay, we see this connection from the Old and New Testament. Okay, great. That's also where we get the names of Joachim and Anne for Mary's parents. So there was some dialogue in that gospel, maybe of Joseph, but that was not chosen as the canon, because first, it was ever attributed, actually James himself that wrote it, but secondly, because there's certain passages in that gospel that are not congruent with who the apostolic teaching taught who Jesus was. For instance, there was a story about Jesus when he was young in Nazareth, got angry with one of his friends and decided to smote him. But then he repented and brought that child back to life. Now, does God have that authority? Yes, he could. But also the fact that he repented shows that he sinned. And God cannot sin. Jesus cannot sin. And so therefore, that would be an inauthentic story of Jesus, and therefore would not be accepted as the canon. So I say all that just because, in the actual gospel writers, we see kind of mentions of Joseph about 4 times. In the infancy narratives, we hear again when they lose him in the temple. And then we hear him finally when it's mentioned before Jesus starts his ministry that Joseph died. So we don't know when that happened, whether that was, we know it was sometimes after the time he was 12 years old, because he was around when he was 12. But we don't know if that happened right before he started his ministry at 30. Did that happen right after that moment at 12 years old? There's a lot of mysteries surrounding St. Joseph. And to the point where there's only one word that describes him in the entire gospel: righteous. Right? Yeah. So, I mean, I think most scholars would say the reason we don't hear much about him is because he just wasn't written about in the Gospels. Maybe the writers didn't know much about him because he was already dead by the time they started writing their Gospels. But also, too, that could just be a sign of Joseph's humility and his purity, too. Right?
What book is that where it talks about when he died? You know that one?
Well, I mean, as far as when Joseph died, it's only briefly mentioned. I can't remember. I mean, it just says it's really right before. I think it's the gospel. I want to say Matthew, but I could be wrong. But all it really says in there is that Joseph had died. That was it. Oh, okay. And Jesus started after Joseph died. Okay. And so there's really no. I mean, it's just Joseph died. Okay, good. We know. Awesome. But we don't know exactly when that happened.
Okay.
Right. Yeah.
Thank you.
As a matter of fact, it's kind of funny. There was a, I think I talked about this before, but there was a going theory on the internet. So take it for what it's worth. That Jesus, after he turned 13, because at that point he was a man, he kind of went on this kind of pilgrimage, I guess, better word, through like Persia and India, and even in India. And was actually evangelizing even there about who he was. And they said they found these Sanskrit writings from these ancient times, about the time of Jesus, that talked about this Hebrew Galilean named Yeshua, who was preaching monotheism, and he was actually run afoul of many of the pagan priests, and to the point they actually wanted to kill him. He actually gained some followers. But then he traveled back the same route, a trade route back through Persia into Galilee around the age of, he was about 30 years old. So one would probably think that Joseph would still been alive during that time, because otherwise Jesus would have abandoned his mother to be, flourish for herself. So Joseph may have died, or maybe Jesus found out he died and then he came back. from that. Now, that's a theory that's not substantiated, and so, but I think it's kind of interesting to think about. But yeah, we don't really know for sure any of that information.
Okay.
All right, well,
Questions
There's
on
a-
the film? Yeah.
someone's here.
I was just going to say, there's a pretty good book I picked up in, I think, 2015, The Life and Glories of Saint Joseph. And it kind of goes into what you're describing. You don't hear anything from the guy, but we can learn a lot about him from his reactions to stuff around him and, Mary and Jesus and all of that stuff. Highly recommend.
Yeah, I mean, I think that what we can say is that, he definitely was the head of the family. It was his decisions that led the direction of the Holy Family. He had great responsibility, and also, I mean, apparently he raised Jesus very well. I mean, to teach him how to have a trade. We would assume that he taught his trade of carpentry, which also wasn't just carpentry. It could also been like masonry and all the things going on, right? And really took care of him, taught Jesus how to pray as a Jewish man, instilled in him the virtues of the faith, even though he didn't need that installation, but kind of taught him how to do things in a human way. And I think that's kind of the key, is that we talk about like the knowledge of Jesus. So there's always this kind of interesting question, like, when did Jesus know that he was God, right? Now, Orthodox Christianity would dictate that, well, he always knew. Even as an infant, he would have some sense that he was God. But there almost is some kind of limitation in many ways, because many theologians argue that Jesus had 3 types of knowledge. So he had angelic knowledge, meaning he would know the essence of all things. So if I were to point to this, cup, and I say, tell me what the essence of the cup is, right? Many may say, well, it holds liquid. Well, that's the purpose of it, but that's not the essence of it. Well, it's made out of metal. Well, that's the material. That's not necessarily the essence of it. Okay, well, it's used for drinking. Well, again, that's, to say what the essence of a thing is, it's really hard for us as humans to know that. But an angel does. So if an angel would come to you, they say, if you ask them what the essence of the cup, they will be able to tell you, right? Oh, okay. Well, now we may not comprehend that because we have limited knowledge, but an angel would be able to do that. But above that, Jesus, of course, had the beatific vision. So he could see God for who he was, because he was God, right? So he knew that there was God the Father, there was God the Holy Spirit, that he was God. So he would not have had faith at all, because he didn't need faith. He knew these things. Even though he's the standard and the epitome of all virtues, he would not have had faith. The other thing that he would have had, because he has a human nature, would be human knowledge or experiential knowledge. So that's kind of an interesting thing, because you could say that, did God know or have the experience of nailing a nail into 2 boards and put them together? You would say that, well, God would have the knowledge of, let's say, the force required, and the effect of doing that, and the essence of what that is, and all these different things of what that would be. But to actually experience the vibration in your hand and to see the nail go into the board, God would not have had that until he had a body. And so Jesus's incarnation, it doesn't necessarily add to the knowledge of God, but it definitely would be a different aspect to that. But that would require Joseph to kind of provide that, right? It was also kind of asked, well, did Jesus ever fail? Did he ever maybe screw up? If he was nailing that board, did he ever hit his thumb? Well, maybe, but if he did, he would have done it perfectly. So it's kind of an interesting discussion. But no, Joseph was instrumental in that, right? And not only just for Jesus, but also for the Blessed Mother. Finding a home for her, finding means for her. Yeah, there's a lot we can say about it, but he doesn't say much. Yeah, thanks, Daniel, for that recommendation. That's good. Thank you.
Yeah, right on.
I jotted that down, Daniel. Thank you.
Good. Any other questions?
I have kind of it might be a very, very simple one, Father, but
Good. I like
something
simple.
that, yeah, well, okay, so I'll just kind of toss it out there and we'll see where it goes. But so we say, you know, Lord have mercy a lot. We ask for mercy a lot. Mercy, 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 mercy. And in my experience, usually when we use a phrase or a thing often in the Catholic Church, there's a really deep, rich meaning to it. And it's not just as simple as, you know, it's terrible to be a human, give us mercy. So when we say God is a God of mercy, what does that mean to you? Can you unpack that a little bit?
Sure. I think to kind of get a good understanding of that, we look at the sacrament of reconciliation. So when I talk to the second graders or even the fifth graders about reconciliation, we talk about the aspect of the sacrament and what's required of it and what you need. But also I think it's sometimes misunderstood. Like the question I ask them is, when are you forgiven of your sins then? Right. So we understand the sacrament of reconciliation forgives us of mortal sin, right? We reconcile ourselves with God and reestablish relationship that we lost. The question is though, when does that happen in the sacrament? And maybe I'll throw that to the group here. Does anyone know when that happens?
During the absolution.
Absolution, right? So the question that I have for them is, okay, well, if absolution forgives you your sins, why do you do a penance? Right? And I think that's an interesting question. So the fundamental aspect of that is, or maybe this is a question to throw out. Can we give God justice?
That was going to be what I was going to say. God is just, we can certainly be forgiven, but we still need to make good on the transgression, right? So
right.
I that kind of seems, penance seems perfectly reasonable, even if you've been forgiven.
But I guess, I'm sorry, go ahead, Daniel.
Well, I was going to say, I guess it would be, it might be tempting to say, well, the forgiveness is contingent on the penance being done. I don't know.
I can see how you can maybe come to that conclusion based on the sacrament and why we do it.
Right.
But I think the thing we have to understand is justice, the virtue of justice is giving to one what one is due. Okay. So I cannot give God what he is due. It is impossible for me as a finite human being to give an infinite being something that they're due. Not just like in general, but like the fact I exist, the fact I have good that happens in my life, I don't deserve that. And I can't pay that back. Now, so God understands that. And he recognizes that and says, well, even though you can't give me justice, I'm going to give you mercy. Right? So we can't give God justice, but we can give each other justice. And so the purpose of the penance is not to give justice to God or to say, okay, I'm paying you back now, God, by these 2 Hail Marys that won our Father. Gotcha. We're good, right? It's that we can actually reconcile with each other. Because when we sin, we not only offend God, we actually offend each other. And maybe not in explicit ways, but even implicit. So some may say like, well, let's say, this might be a big one. I'm watching pornography at home, right? I'm not hurting anyone. I'm minding my own business, right? So, okay, maybe God doesn't want me to do that because of the nature of what the sexual act is. That's a bond of unity between me and my loved one, my spouse. And so, okay, I can understand how God might be offended by that. But how am I offending somebody else by doing it? Well, you're offending your wife because, she should be good enough for you as far as that is concerned. but also you're offending the person that you're objectifying in the screen. And so, okay, I can give justice back to my wife and that woman or that man on the screen. And I can do that through the penance I do. But I can't give that back to God. Right? So our God is such a loving God that he understands us completely and knows this. And so even though we are redeemed by Jesus Christ, we can sever that relationship with him, and he wants to reestablish that. And the only way that he can do that is through the mercy he gives us. Right? So that's the purpose of the sacrament. And so when we say, like in the Confiteor, or we talk about the Kyrie, we see that actually in the Mass. So the sacrament of reconciliation does forgive mortal sins. The sacrament of the Eucharist does forgive venial sins. But in order to be forgiven of those venial sins, we need to call them to mind. So the purpose of that Confiteor and that Kyrie in the very beginning of Mass is for us to actually have the opportunity to say, okay, here are the things I've done. They're not mortal, but I've failed in these ways. And I'm giving the Lord to you, Jesus. And in your sacrifice, we're about to witness that we're brought present to the cross, and I can lay these at the foot of the cross, and you can redeem me in them. And then I'm going to take you into my very self at that moment to cleanse me of those actions. So that's a powerful moment. I think it's somewhat overlooked sometimes, probably because a lot of people come in late. They may miss that part. Maybe that's true. I don't know. But I think that's an important part of the Mass that we don't necessarily recognize all the time. That Confiteor, there is a giving over of the sin there that culminates in the reception of the Eucharist. And if we're not there for that moment, it's kind of an interesting question, because like some people might ask, well, should I present myself for communion then? I mean, you can still offer them up at some point in the Mass other than at the Confiteor, but there's kind of a lack in that respect, that there's a communal aspect that you're missing out on, right? I think fundamentally it comes down to this basic question. People ask this all the time, and I think they do this genuinely. I don't think this is really kind of like, trying to get around things, but okay, what point of the Mass do I have to be there for it to be a Mass? And I think the funny thing about that is the church doesn't really give a definitive answer there. And I think the reason she doesn't is because, well, the understanding is you're there for the entire thing, right? I mean, that seems like a very odd question. Well, how late do I get there to be back? Well, don't be late. I mean, just be there. That's the idea. But I think, like, practically speaking, it's kind of an open question. Because some may argue, well, you should be there at least for the gospel, because the Eucharist and the Word go together, right? And that's fair. I think some people might say, well, you should be at least for the offertory, because that's when you minister as a baptized priest by offering up your spiritual sacrifice and your sins in that action in the offertory. Okay, I think some, and this is kind of where my line would be. I would say if you're not there to witness the sacrifice of the Mass, meaning you weren't there to actually hear the words of institution be said and witness that and participate in it, I don't think you should come up. And I've gotten some flack for that. I've mostly in daily Mass. Usually with the Sunday Mass, I can't tell. If someone comes in late, I don't. Maybe you did, maybe you didn't. I don't know. But in daily Mass is sometimes very evident. And there was one instance where, oh boy, this wonderful woman, she's a very faithful woman. She came in and it was like the Our Father. And I was like, okay. So she presented herself for communion. And I went over to her and I said, oh, I noticed you came in after the words. So here's why I said, and this will be my tech. Can you go back and watch the stream later? Or can you at least go and maybe read the gospel for the day, right? Now, this person said, Father, don't worry about it. I'm coming back to Mass tonight anyway. It was a Saturday. Okay. From that, though, people saw that. and then became, oh, Father Man's denying communion to people. Well, yeah, I kind of did, but I was trying to give every opportunity for this person to receive it. And that's what my job would be. But you can't argue with that. Well, you weren't here for the entire mass. Now, there may be other reasons. Maybe your car broke down. Okay, I'm open to that. And if this person would have said that, okay, great, here you go. Got body of Christ, right? But I think it goes to show that I think how sacred that is, but also how misconstrued it can become. And maybe going back to what Mickey was talking about earlier, I mean, in some ways, in Novus Ordo, there's a great familiarity with the Eucharist, which I think is a good. But I think that we've gone so far in that direction, we've kind of lost the reverence of what the Eucharist is. And so there has to be some medivia there. And I think that's kind of, I don't know how to overcome that. Maybe use of Latin might bring that back. I don't know. But yeah, we understand God of being merciful is that he can't help but do that for us because he loves us. And so because we can't pay him back for all he's done for us, he's like the king in the parable of the steward, the wicked steward, right? I'm going to forgive your debt. Good. Now go do the same, right? But also, justice can be upheld when it should be, or when it should be upheld when it can be. Maybe that's the best way to put it, right? Because even that story, when that servant then went to the other servant, started beating him and getting that less money out. Well, he was still in the prison because he didn't have to pay back his own debt, but he was put in prison for a while. So yeah, good.
Thank you, Father.
My pleasure. Any other thoughts, comments? Okay. Well, great. Well, thank you all for coming. Appreciate you coming, and we'll see you hopefully next week.
Thank you very much for all the info.
My pleasure. You guys have a good night.
You too.
Cheers.
All
God bless.
right.
That's my daughter that logged in.
Oh, great. Well, I'm glad she came.